Can you put a teleprompter on a gimbal with your camera? Yes, actually you can. I did it with this. So let's talk about it. Recently at work, I was doing a small blue screen video shoot for a client with a team of 3, and the client had a need for the talent to turn to an off-screen camera and then stand up and start walking towards the camera through and out of the small studio we were filming in, with the camera following, so the cameraman moving backwards, all while the talent was reading from the teleprompter and speaking into the camera. The first shot with the mobile rig we needed was to get a kind of behind the scenes shot. It was meant to actually show the blue screen, the lighting, the props, and wouldn't be keyed out in post like the rest of the video shoot that day. And the rest of the shots were around the offices and lobby of the building, all of them still having talent walking towards and speaking to camera the entire time. So the client asked if we could maybe use an easy rig, which I don't think is the right type of rig for what we needed to do. I think it would have been too bulky for a single operator. Then they asked if we could have a camera or teleprompter on maybe a dolly and just move the whole thing around on the floor. But the problems were that, one, we were in a very small studio space located inside the client's corporate offices, so not a lot of room to move around. Number 2, the floor was uneven and had some obstacles which would have made any dolly moves impossible without complete and utter shaking of the camera, ruining the shot. And 3, it would have just made for quite the process to try to even dolly the camera with a huge 17-inch teleprompter on the front and having a crew member try to manage the cables as we moved backwards because we had to have power going to the teleprompter screen that we were using. And a large rig would have just been too much trouble to move throughout the rest of the hallways and lobby of the main building to get the other shots. So instead of all that, I used this rig. This is a Sony a7 III with a Tamron 17-28 lens on a Zhiyun Crane Plus gimbal, a Rode Wireless Go receiver, and the Padcaster Parrot small teleprompter attached to the front of the lens, holding my iPhone 12 mini as the device feeding the script to the talent. And my iPhone was using the Prompt Smart Pro app to feed the script to the talent because that app uses the microphone on the iPhone to listen for a voice and will automatically scroll the script as the person speaks. And overall, this rig worked really great and we got all the shots we needed while not being tethered to anything and being able to just move freely around the offices, in and out of doorways, with talent being able to see and read their script the entire time. So some of you may be watching this and maybe, perhaps thinking, this isn't a professional rig, and initially I kind of had similar thoughts, like should I show up with this stuff? I mean, the gimbal is small, it's one of the smallest, lowest cost gimbals out there, it was only $400, it can't hold a lot of weight, and it's a tiny consumer teleprompter, and the Sony a7 III only does 8-bit video, and we're using Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K cameras and shooting RAW for the main blue screen shots. Would the footage match well enough? Is this professional enough? Well, I think it is, because I know that being a professional isn't just about the gear, it's about your knowledge and skills as well. And I couldn't use a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera on the mobile rig because the Pocket Cinema cameras don't have good or really continuous autofocus, and I needed great face tracking autofocus as the walk and talk shots were just that, walk and talk, and I needed the talent's face to be in focus at all times. And I mean, why don't I have a Sony FX3 or a Sony a7S III or even an FX6 on a big huge gimbal that costs $1,500? Well, a few reasons. But one of the best reasons is that as a craftsman, I'm able to use the tools at my disposal and still make a great product. Because I know how to use the tools, I know what they can do, and I know what they can't do, and I knew that they could do this job just fine. And I know how to expose properly on this camera. And that's all the video shoot required of this rig because the walk and talk shots were a small portion of the entire shoot. A bad craftsman blames their tools. I got the job done with this, and it worked great. It worked great for the talent, the video editor was happy, and the client was happy, and that's all I needed to ensure that this rig was a good choice for this shoot. Now, I was a little concerned if this particular gimbal, or any gimbal, would hold all this additional weight of a teleprompter and iPhone out front, because these items add a lot of weight way out here over the end of the lens. But I was able to get it balanced with the Padcaster teleprompter and my iPhone 12 mini on the front. but I had to use my Tamron 17-28 lens because it's the smallest, shortest, and lightest lens I own. And being shorter, it pulls the weight of the camera closer to the back. And I needed to be able to get the weight shifted all the way back as far as I could so that the additional weight out on front would balance this whole rig out. And that was difficult with this gimbal because the position of the motor on the back doesn't allow you to scoot the camera back as far as you could with other gimbals that sometimes they have dropped this motor down to where you can scoot the camera back. This gimbal's not built like that, but as you can see, I was able to balance it. The gimbal's not even on right now, and it balances fairly well in most any position. So I was able to confirm that this rig was going to work, and I got it balanced. Just barely, but it worked. And since I wasn't doing any sort of major tilt up or tilt down shots or crazy rolling side shots, I kind of just made sure it would balance and return to a level position so it wouldn't put as much pressure on the motors if it were slightly out of balance. But I actually got it balanced a little better than being slightly flat. You can see it'll kind of stay in a slightly tilted position. So not bad, and it means the motors weren't under too much stress when the gimbal was turned on. Now the unfortunate part about this Padcaster Parrot teleprompter is its small size, and that means you can't use a very wide angle lens with it or you'll see the teleprompter in the shot. And even with this Tamron 70-28 lens zoomed all the way to 28 millimeters, you could still see the edges of the teleprompter in the camera frame. So using the tools I have at my disposal, I put the Sony a7 III into crop mode, which punches in on the sensor and makes the field of view a little tighter. With this prompter, you have to be somewhere around 32 to 34 millimeter zoom on a full frame to completely get rid of seeing the prompter in the lens. But again, the Tamron 70-28 obviously only goes to 28 millimeters. So put the camera in crop mode, zoom the lens all the way back to 17 millimeters, which is now about the equivalent field of view of a 25 millimeter lens. Then I just started zooming in from 17 until the edges of the prompter disappeared, and that landed me somewhere around 22 millimeters on the Tamron 17-28, which is roughly the equivalent field of view as a 33 millimeter if I weren't in crop mode. And unfortunately, I couldn't swap out the lens and use my Tamron 28-75 because this lens is longer, heavier, and I don't think this gimbal would have been able to be balanced with the longer, heavier lens and the teleprompter and the iPhone out front. So I had to use the Tamron 17-28. But of course, remember the talent needed to be close enough to read a small iPhone screen and text and still get a good field of view of, the head to shoulders shot. So I couldn't just keep zooming in. I had to keep it at a distance that would keep the teleprompter out of the frame and have the talent be able to be close enough for the shot I needed so that they could still read the small text on this phone. But it all worked out great. 33 millimeters isn't too far away, still got the talent in a nice visual frame, and it all worked out really well. Not a lot of room for error, and generally that's not where I like to be, backed into a corner with no options, but sometimes that's just what you have to work with and the tools you have at your disposal. So why didn't I just go out and rent a bigger gimbal? And maybe you ask, why didn't I rent a different camera than the Sony a7 III for a paid client shoot? Well, other than the previously mentioned reasons about knowing my tools, number one, the video shoot came up very quickly and there wasn't much time to try to go rent a gimbal and camera, pick it up from the rental company, figure it out since I would have been unfamiliar with a different gimbal, and then use it effectively on the shoot. It's not that I couldn't have gotten it done. I think that as a professional, I should be able to use professional tools, but in the short timeline that we had, I was just more familiar with what I owned, plus I was the one probably going to be operating this setup. As for using the Sony a7 III versus renting something newer like the Sony FX3 or Sony a7S III, again, we were on a bit of a time crunch and a bit of a budget crunch, and since I already owned all of this equipment, it gave me time before the shoot to set it up, see if it would balance, test it, and I confirmed it was going to work just fine for what we needed, so we went with it. Now, this particular gimbal and camera combination isn't the best, mainly because of some ergonomic reasons more than anything, since the Sony a7 III doesn't have a flip out screen, it only has a flip up screen, and as you can see, the motor is in the way. I'm used to dealing with it with this camera and gimbal setup. It would be better with the Sony a7 IV, a7S III to have this screen be able to flip out, but again, this works. You just have to kind of look around the motor and it works just fine. It's a little less useful on ergonomics. Granted, a different gimbal would maybe have the motor slid down in the lower position and you could see the back of the camera. But again, it works. I'm used to operating it this way. It's not ideal, but it works and it got the job done. So again, tools versus craftsman. But I was glad it worked out, and it kind of proved to me that this particular setup can work. It's actually the first time I've been asked for a mobile teleprompter rig, and now I've got some more experience under my belt with this rig. I'm definitely at the limits of all the gear, the gimbal, the weight it can hold, the lens, and the teleprompter with having to put the camera in crop mode and zoom in, how much this gimbal can actually hold and balance. I'm at the limits of pretty much every piece of equipment. And actually the Rode Wireless Go provided just enough, a little bit of extra weight at the back to just help it balance a little better. So little things like that can actually help your balance and weight distribution. But it was a bit of a proof of concept model for me, and made me happy that I was able to use the tools at my disposal with the knowledge that I have up here. There's some knowledge up there. I get to use it occasionally. And I knew a mobile rig like this on a gimbal was going to work much better than trying to dolly a camera around with a huge teleprompter on a wheeled tripod, or trying to have someone manage a teleprompter on an easy rig. I think those options would have made the footage way too shaky and just not smooth enough for what we were going for, especially given how mobile we needed to be for the different shots. So that's it. The next time someone asks you if they can have a mobile rig with a teleprompter, because maybe the talent didn't have time to memorize their lines, tell them yes, they can have a mobile rig with a teleprompter. Depending on the situation, you might choose a different or larger gimbal, but it can be done if you know your tools. All right, that's it. Happy filming. Later. Like Ron Burgundy. I mistyped the script and I keep reading it incorrectly. So the next time someone asks you for if they can have, I'm Ron Burgundy.